3 sessions. This is the first session in the backend track. I hope everyone is able to hear me, right? Okay. Okay, so I'm Aman and she's Ghazal. We'll both be taking this session, right? Distance. Okay. Hello. 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 Right. Okay. So, how many of you have previously worked on backend engineering of any sorts? Any of you? Okay, and this session is basically we'll start from scratch. It will be very beginner friendly, and we'll basically build apps with Flask at the ending, right? Okay, so we'll start with API basics, and then we'll move on to what REST is, and then at the end we'll basically use Flask to build our own API. All right. Okay, so let's start. So API. Anyone? What's an API? What's an API? All right. So an API. Okay. Yeah, exactly. API is anything like it helps two applications communicate with each other. So yeah, like when it comes to web dev, like there's a front end server, there's a front end elements and interface through which user interacts, and there's a backend server through which user sends data, retrieves data. Okay, so the API makes API helps both of these communicate with each other. Like most of the popular websites use this API. All the websites use this API to get retrieve data. That's like website. Okay. Yeah. Let's just quickly go to if we go to the networks tab over here and just reload, we can actually look at all the requests Google sends to its server to basically retrieve various data like the logo of the Google, for example. All right. So yeah, like basically whenever you interact with the website, it basically sends a request, and we can look at the request over here. Like for example, all requests. For some reason, it's not. I just moved on it. Yeah. Whenever you use this website, this sends a lot of API requests, and we get the responses whenever you interact with it. Like you search, and it will send API requests to basically retrieve the autocompletes and etc. So APIs are used in every website we use, and it's very important for retrieving data and other operations. So yeah, any API interaction is basically has two parts: a request which the client sends to the server, and the response it receives with all the data you need, right? So any API call you do is you basically do it to do this operations. They're basically known as CRUD operations. These are the 4 basic operations you do by sending an API call, like create, read, and update and delete, right? To do these 4 operations, we basically have these HTTP methods which specify, which we send in the request, which specify which operation we want to do. Like for example, we have this post method for HTTP method, which basically helps us, which basically conveys that we need to create some resource, which we need to create some create and store some data on the server. Like we have the get HTTP method to basically retrieve some data. We have the put to update and delete to delete. There are many other HTTP methods too, but these are the most common HTTP methods out there, right? So the request basically basically the first line of that we'll basically look at how a request looks like. We can actually look at it right here. Yeah. Yes. So the response. Let's leave it. Okay, the request basically has the first line of request is basically the request line. It contains the method of the request, the URL of the backend server, and the HTTP version. Okay, the method conveys, as I said, what exactly do you want to do with the request, if you want to retrieve the data or store it, etc. And then we have the headers, which basically contain some extra information of the request, some metadata. Like it may contain, like, for example, this content type header basically conveys that the request we are sending stores data of the type JSON. This authorization is used for sending various tokens for our authorization purposes. We'll look at authorization tokens in the next session. And there are many other headers too. Right. And then we have the body, which we use to send data to our server, to our backend server. Yeah, and we generally use it in post put and request to basically send update our data. Right. Now we have Postman. Postman is basically an app we use for API testing. It makes it very convenient to test whatever we build. Right. Now let's just we can use it. So this is how Postman actually looks like. Uh, you put in the URL over here. You put in the URL over here, select the request you're making, and we'll get the response. I think we can use some API. Let's just use the code forces here. Many popular websites out there provide their own APIs so that we can retrieve the data whatever we want. Like we can use this code forces API. This is the documentation of the API. It basically contains all the different endpoints that are available to which we can send our request and we'll get the response. A few requests are like open to all, like you need not send some authorization token or anything. You just need to send the request with whatever content you want and you'll get it. And a few endpoints which are which basically contain some private information. You need to send some authorization token and all. So let us just look at some public endpoint like this user.info. This basically contains like how our request should look like to get a valid response. I'll just copy this and let's just send a get request. Yeah. So this is the URL to which we are sending our request. To send our in this endpoint, we're basically using it to retrieve the user info. So we need to send some data along with it. Like in this case, we are sending the handle of the user of which we need the info, right? So we can either send the data in the body or we can send it in the URL itself. In a GET request, we generally send it in the URL itself because it's very simple to send. We only use the body when the data we are sending is very complicated, like when it's nested or anything. But for simple data, we are whenever we're sending simple data, we just send it in the URL itself. So after these are known as query parameters, by the way. We just put a question mark and then we have some key value pairs. Like in this case, we have handles and the values of handles. Right. How do we zoom in predictor? Right. Is it visible now? Okay. So yeah, this is the URL to which we are sending it. Okay, a bit more. Oh. There. Okay. Side वाला रहने दें. All right. Is it visible? All right. So Yeah, I was talking about query parameters. So we just put a question mark and follow it with key value pairs, which in which we send the data to the server, and yeah, and it, we just get the response with all the data we want along with a status code. We'll talk about that later. Okay. So in this case, it is just a simple request. We can just type it with our hands or the handles and everything. But for some cases we may not type all the requests, and so I'll just take another example to better convey my point. So I'll just take this example of this Marvel API I have. Just to make sure everyone is following along, this tool is used for the API. All right. So this is the Marvel API, right? We can basically use it to get information about all the characters, comics, etc. If you want to build some app of using this data, we can. So basically, to send a request to this Marvel API, it basically asks us to send some things along with the query, along with the request. Okay. So it asks us in the query parameters. It asks us to basically send the API key, a timestamp and a hash. Okay, I'll go through what all these things are. Okay, so all, as I said earlier, all APIs are not open to public. Like we need some API key in order to send a request to some APIs. So in this case, Marvel uses this API keys in order to limit the number of requests we send per day. It has a limit like around 3,000 requests per day. It basically does this to reduce the load on its servers and everything, right? So it provided me a private key and a public key when I made this account. So what it asked me to do is it asked me to send a timestamp, which basically a timestamp or any string which changes on a request to request basis. Okay, so this is basically for security purposes, so that a request once sent can only if anyone else no yeah, this TS is basically used for security purposes, right? So once I send a request, and if anyone gets hold of that request, any third party gets hold of that request, they cannot use it again. So yeah, it is used to make sure that only the right person is using the APIs for the calls, right? And the next parameter is basically a hash parameter. So yeah, anyone knows what a hash function is? Anyone? What? Yeah, exactly. A hash function is basically a one-to-one mapping. Like it's a one-way function. One, you give it an input and you get it output. You get output, but you cannot decipher the input from the output. Okay, so we basically use it for security purposes again. So yeah, what it asks us to do is basically use a hash function known as MD5. It asks us to make a certain string with the timestamp, the private key, and the public key. Do hash it and send it along with the request and the query parameters. Right. So whenever we are sending the request to the API, we can't just manually calculate the hash every time we are testing it. So what a feature of Postman is there's something called a pre-request scripts. Okay. So Postman runs the scripts every time it is sending before sending a request, uh, and we can use this to basically convert our key to a hash and then send the request. Okay. So this is basic JavaScript code. So this is a basic JavaScript code which basically contains the private key, the public key. It gets the timestamp and just hashes it using the inbuilt function. All right. And then we set what is known as environment variables. Okay, so environment variables are basically variables in the Postman app which we can use while sending a request. Like I set the environment variables ts public key and hash over here in the script, and I can use it in the request like this over here. Okay, so whenever I send the request, it basically runs the script over there, calculates all these things, and then it sends the response. Yeah, I just got the response with the status code okay. Yeah, I can look at the console to look how the request actually went. Like, hmm. Yeah, I actually in the code force API documentation, you can look at how the you can look at the example usage of how how we send the request, right? There's a URL over here. I'll just go there. Yeah. Hmm. Yeah, this is the example usage over here. If you can look at the URL, right? So here, after that, we have a question mark followed by key value pairs. Okay. So we have a key with the name handles, and then we have the input is the handles we passed on to it. Like we have the values over here. Did you get it? Right. Okay. So, Postman automatically runs the scripts before sending the request and updates the environment variables accordingly. We also have what is known as post response scripts, which we can basically use to further analyze whatever responses we get. We can write tests, etc. There are other features like flows, which uh, yeah, we can use this flows to basically further test some other complicated some other things like in development we might want like we want to send a request to some endpoint and then use the data from that endpoint to further send a request to another endpoint. We can do it very easily with using this graphical interface. Like we send a request to some API. If it is successful, we can send it to some other API. Uh, you can send it to some other API. There are many methods over here. You can further explore it later. Okay. So yeah, that was Postman, and it is very it makes it very convenient to test our APIs. Right. Yeah, and here whenever we send a request to through Postman, we basically get the response with the status code over here. Okay, the status code indicates the status of the response as a yeah. So there are many status codes out there. A few main ones are like the 200 series indicate the successful responses, like 200 okay, 201 created, etc. Like and this 400 status codes indicates that there is some error in the request in the request the client sent. For example, 404 not found. Yeah. So there are many other status codes. You can look at it later. Right. Now let's move on to REST. So REST is actually just an architectural style we use for building our APIs. Let's look at what the key features and why we even use REST over here. Yeah. One of the main feature of REST is that REST APIs support this stateless communication. Now what is stateless communication? You may ask. So whenever user uses some website, for example, some user uses some shopping website online. So like there's some session data the user creates during the session. Like for example, in the shopping website case, the user might add some products to the cart, etc. So in a stateful APIs, what we do is basically we create some storage space for the user on the server itself or in some database, and we store the session data on the server side. So whenever the user interacts with the site, basically we update the session data on the server side. We create a separate storage and we give the user a session ID. Basically, the stateful API we create a session on the server side and give the user a session ID. When the user further sends some request to the server, he basically uses the session ID and sends a request to the server. On the server side, we use the session ID and validate the request and then do the further operations like processing the response. Okay. Now, when it comes to a stateless API, what we do is we basically do not store this session data on the server side. All the data that we require for sending the response is basically sent in the request itself. So we do not store any state on the server side. Yeah. So server does not store any client context between the requests, and every request has all the data you need. Yeah. So this is beneficial in some ways because we need not store anything on the server. So This might be faster in few cases. Another characteristic is that we clearly separate the front end from the back end part. So the client side development will and the back end development will like evolve independently. So this much more it makes development much more feasible and yeah. And a few responses in REST, what we do is basically few responses are very frequent. We send the same response again and again very frequently. So to increase performance, what we can do is basically we can cache it somewhere on the server side or on the client, so that whenever we get a request for the response, we can send it much faster. We need not do all the processing we do for other responses. So yeah, we generally cache many requests. Many generally get requests. We cache many get requests because we are the get request basically just retrieve the data, and the data for example some website elements like and logo images etc. They are the same. We send the same responses to a lot of people, so we just cache it and use it. Another thing about REST is we basically use a uniform interface with the REST. Like for example, to interact with any resource or in any data, basically define a certain URL out there. Like for example, we want to update or delete some specific data related to a user. We just go to the endpoint of the users, type in the ID in the path itself, and just send a request with our HTTP method and do the further processing. And also we basically just use the HTTP methods and REST architecture too, which further simplifies things. Okay, so now why use REST? We use REST because it basically simplifies things a lot when it comes to sending this request and everything. Because we basically just use the HTTP methods and and the HTTP protocol itself things. And we also just saw that it was stateless, so uh, we need not store anything on the server. So this helps us in scaling the servers. This helps us in basically we can easily scale further. Like for example, in the case of stateful APIs, we cannot scale very easily because we basically store the session data in a particular server. So the database will become some sort of a bottleneck there. In the case of stateless APIs, we basically send the data in every request, so we can independently scale the servers as easily. Right? So that's out of the way. Now let's move on to Flask. Okay, so Flask is basically a lightweight framework in Python itself. So we'll build our own APIs now. Ghazal will continue the session.
Just one sec. Hello everyone, I am Ghazal, another XC from DevClub, and I'm going to talk about Flask and REST API implementation with it. So far in the lecture we have talked about what basically an API is, what a REST API is, why is it used, and the crux of this entire topic, which is the journey of request and response. But with all this information, how do I turn it into something real? How do I make an API? So this question brings us back to the journey of request and response. So what happens is when the client sends a request to the server, or here maybe an API, this API receives it, processes it, and like extracts the data, processes it, and sends it back to the client. But what if we have to write the code for every little thing, like extracting the JSON data and reading it and then processing it? It will be manually very exhausting. This is where Flask comes in. Flask is a framework which is kind of like a pre-built toolkit or a template which will give you the basic tools and the structure to build an application. So by this, it's going to save you time by providing you the common functions like request handling or extracting the data, etc. Okay, so now what is Flask? It is a micro web framework for Python. It is simple, flexible, scalable, and it is lightweight. It's lightweight because it comes only with essential features to build the application. There are no built-in components like authentication or database handling. It is perfect for small projects or web apps, but it is scalable. That is, you can start it small but integrate third-party libraries into it and scale it into a larger project. Now, about the key features of Flask. It is minimalistic, like we talked about in the last section, and it is modular, which means there is easy integration of third-party libraries which are not already present in the Flask, for example, maybe database management or authentication. Then there is built-in development server and debugger, routing and URL mapping. Both of these you'll learn and understand better in the hands-on implementation, which we'll do later. Then it also provides functions like request handling, wherein it processes the HTTP request which is sent by the browser and sends back the HTTP response. So this is response handling. Then we have Jinja 2 templating engine for dynamic content. So Flask supports both web applications and APIs. Here we are only building the API, but a web application will in return provide you with HTML content or CSS static files. For that, Jinja 2 templating engine is required. Otherwise, here we do not need it. So all in all, Flask will provide you with some basic functions which will help you build the very basic structure of the app and save you time. Then we come for the prerequisites of Flask. ऑल ऑफ़ यू माइट नो कि टर्मिनल कैसे ओपन करते हैं. अगर किसी को नहीं आता तो मुझे एक बार जस्ट शो ऑफ हैंड्स कि सबको आता है कि नहीं, अदरवाइज़ मैं साइड बाय साइड समझा दूँगी कि टर्मिनल होता क्या है. तो अभी टर्मिनल सबसे पहले ओपन करेंगे. मे बी जस्ट स्पॉटलाइट सर्च, वहाँ पे सर्च कर लो टर्मिनल एंड वन सेक. या सो इज़ इट विजिबल नाउ? ओके, हाँ, ये कमांड्स हैं फॉर विंडोज़ एंड मैक, तो यू कैन लुक एट देम और ऐसे यू कैन ओपन टर्मिनल. तो टर्मिनल होता क्या है कि इट इज़ अ CLI विच इज़ अ कमांड लाइन इंटरफेस. दूसरा होता है GUI विच इज़ ग्राफिकल यूज़र इंटरफेस. सो जस्ट लाइक अपने लैपटॉप पे जाके इफ़ यू डू अ राइट क्लिक और तुम एक नया फोल्डर बनाते हो, दैट सेम थिंग यू कैन डू विद अ कमांड इन टर्मिनल. वैसे ही फॉर एग्जाम्पल इफ़ यू गो इन टू, यू डबल क्लिक एंड यू गो इन टू अ फोल्डर, राइट? The same thing you have to do in terminal with a particular command. So this is what terminal is. Okay, तो यहाँ पे जो हमने सबसे पहले चीज़ करनी है विच इज़ मेकिंग अ डायरेक्टरी फॉर योर एप्लीकेशन. तो फॉर एग्जांपल इसके लिए मैं यूज़ करूँगी mkdir, जो कि टर्मिनल में फंक्शन होता है, और साथ में द नेम ऑफ द डायरेक्टरी दैट आई वांट टू कीप. फॉर एग्जांपल हेयर spark_2.1. या तो दिस हैज़ क्रिएटेड इट. देन मैं फाइंडर में जाके दिखा देती हूँ कि हाउ दैट इट हैज़ बीन क्रिएटेड. या इट विल विजिबल नाउ. तो यहाँ पे क्रिएट हो गया. देन with a double click I have gone inside the directory in my local machine, but यहाँ पे I have to write this command which is cd spark_2.1. so अभी I am inside my directory. So we have made the project directory. The next thing we have to do is set up and activate my virtual environment. So what is a virtual environment? It is like an isolated bubble which is like a self-contained directory where Python and its packages are isolated from the global environment, global Python environment. For example, you are making two projects at the same time and both of them require different versions of Flask or different version of some other dependency that you have installed. So how will you differentiate? So this is where a virtual environment comes in, जहाँ पे you can differentiate the two. जो भी मैं चीज़ एक वर्चुअल एनवायरनमेंट बनाने के और उसको एक्टिवेट करने के बाद इंस्टॉल करूँगी वो उसके अंदर ही इंस्टॉल होगा. ओके, सो देर आर सम कमांड्स जिनसे वी कैन मेक this you don't need to remember these commands, क्योंकि जब तुम एक प्रोजेक्ट पे काम कर रहे होते हो तो तुम्हें ऑटोमेटिकली वो चीज़ याद हो जाती है, एंड इफ़ लेटर यू फॉरगेट देम तो ठीक है, यू कैन गो बैक. So how do you make it is python 3 -m when v and then the name of the virtual environment that you want to keep. For example, I wanted virt, एंड यहाँ पे यू कैन सी कि एक डायरेक्टरी बन जाएगी या फोल्डर बन जाएगा विच शोज़ कि तुम्हारा वर्चुअल एनवायरनमेंट हैज़ बीन सेटअप. बट दिस इज़ नॉट ऑल एक्चुअली, बिकॉज you have to activate it as well. So now I have to activate it, and this is the command which is source, the name of my virtual environment, and then bin and activate. So yeah, the moment you see this bracketed virt, which is the name of my virtual environment, this means that it has been activated. So these are the commands for Windows and Mac, and ये apply कर लो. एंड यहाँ तक मतलब एक बार कंप्लीट कर लो अपना. हो गया यहाँ तक? ओके. या sorry, I didn't get your doubt. Yeah, it's the name of the virtual environment. So यहाँ पे जैसे python 3 फिर -m venv है, तो then after that flask env is the name of the virtual environment. Yeah, so if you go into that virt का जो folder है, here you will see a bin and then there is an activate. So you can see that in the command as well. So that's how you're activating the virtual environment, if you want to get like this, in this sense. So हो गया क्या सबका? We can move forward, right? Yeah. So we don't have that much time, तो हमें थोड़ा आगे चलना पड़ेगा. The next is installing Flask. So yeah, which is the basis of the entire project that you are making. So you install that and you do pip install Flask, then you hit enter, and yeah, so Flask along with all its dependencies has been downloaded. So किसको पता है कि pip क्या होता है यहाँ पे? किसी anyone? Yeah, so it's a package installer for Python. So जो Python की standard libraries में कुछ चीज़ें नहीं होती हैं, so for installing that we use pip. So it is package installer for Python. So next command we have is pip show flask. तो ये मुझे मेरा version बता देगा Flask का जो have installed. So it is telling me I have installed the 3.1.0 version of Flask, right? Got it? And this also verifies that I have installed Flask successfully. So there was one more thing that I wanted to talk about, is that suppose जो मैंने सब कुछ install किया, I want to add it to a text file, right? जो भी dependencies वगैरह मैंने add करी हैं, I want to add them to the text file, जहाँ पे with their versions they'll be stored. So what I'll do is pip freeze and this and the name, suppose requirements.txt. Yeah, so you can see यहाँ पे एक file बन गई है requirements.txt की. Okay, for some reason this is not opening right now. ओके, इट्स नॉट ओपनिंग, बट इसमें क्या होगा कि सारे जो मैंने जो भी सब कुछ इंस्टॉल किया वो अपने वर्जन्स के साथ वहाँ पे ऐड हो जाएगा. सो इसका यूज़ क्या है कि सपोज़ मेरे को बहुत कुछ ऐड करना है. सो व्हाट आई हैव टू डू इज़ पिप इंस्टॉल दिस एंड दिस एंड दिस. रादर देन दैट what I'll do is I'll add all the names and the versions to this requirements.txt file, right? And then I'll write a command in terminal which is pip install -r and then the name of the file, which is requirement.txt. And when I enter this, all of them will be downloaded at the same time. I won't have to do it manually again and again. So this is how it's better. So yeah, then we have done this. We have completed the Flask installation and done the basic setup of the Flask app. Okay, now we'll create an app.py file, which is the main file which will represent my entire application. So touch creates a new file, right? So touch app.py, and you can see it has been created here. We can now go to VS Code and open like this directory which we created here. Yeah, so is it visible, right? Yeah. Sorry, not audible. Yeah, these are the functions or code that you have to write there. Okay, done. Okay, so now you are all done with this, right? This one. Yeah. This one, right? Yeah. Yeah, all of this. Yeah, this is after it. और ये order है, like first you press project directory, then version environment, then install Flask. So all of you are following with this ना, ज़्यादा fast तो नहीं लग रहा. If it is तो मतलब बता दो, we can slow down the pace, right? Yeah. या मतलब इसमें सारा कुछ वो जो हमने डायरेक्टरी बनाई थी स्टार्टिंग में उसी के अंदर हो रहा है, बिकॉज हमने cd वाली जो कमांड यूज़ की थी. सो आफ्टर दैट वी आर इनसाइड द डायरेक्टरी दैट वी क्रिएटेड. So whatever we are doing, whatever we are installing is inside it is in only, and we have also activated the virtual environment. Okay guys, मतलब can we move forward now? हो गया सबका यहाँ तक? Guys, we can move forward, right? Yeah. Okay, so now we'll start with the basic setup of the app file. We have created it, and now we'll start writing the code. So from Flask we are going to import Flask class, right? So after that we'll initialize a variable or an object. For example, if you have studied oops, you'll know that we have to instantiate a class, and we write this in the bracket we write underscore underscore name. So this is a special variable which will store the name of the current Python file. Okay, and after that now we have set up the class, and then we have created an object of the class. Now we have to run the file. So for that you do you write this if condition that underscore underscore name, if it is equal to main, then you run the file with app.run. Okay, so what the if condition is doing is, if the code is running directly from the file, it will be set, the name variable will be set to main, otherwise it will be set to the Python script that it is being imported from, and that's how you run the file. Okay, so now when I run the file, this says that the server has started and it is running on this URL. Is it visible now? So if I copy this URL now, and yeah, I go to this URL, it will show me that there's an error and the URL has not been found. Why does this happen is because when I'm setting up the Flask server, I have to set up a URL endpoint, or the root, which I talked about earlier, for every route from the basic to the advanced. Okay, because what happens is, when I access a route in the browser, it sends a get request, an HTTP get request to the server, and the server receives it and checks that if there is a route defined or not, and if it is, then it will execute the function which is defined under it. So this is how you set up the route, which is with a decorator function which is predefined here. And for example, I want to set up for this route, and then after that I'll just set up a Python function, for example hello world, and I just return hello world here. Yeah, all of this is being done inside the function only. Yeah, and you can see that it is logging here also, because I went and accessed that route there in the browser at that time. So it's a get request. When I've not specified a method here, but when I'm not specifying a method, the default is get. So I exit the server, run it again, and now when I do this, I can see that hello world has been returned here. You can see it now, right? Okay, so this is done. Now for example, if I want to change something and I don't want that, so I'll manually exit the server, and okay, so there's nothing that has changed. So yeah, so what I'll have to do is, this is where the debugger comes in. I'll just write this condition debug equals true, and now for this change also I'll have to exit manually and rerun the server. Now you can see that it says that debugger is active, right? So whatever changes I make now will automatically be implemented, and I won't have to manually exit and rerun the server. So for example, I change this and it says that it has detected a change, and I change it, and you can see the space between the W and the O, right? So this is what a debugger does. Okay, so suppose now I want to set up another route. So I'll just set the decorator function, and for example I'll name it /about, because I have to name them differently. And yeah, so then I'll set up the Python function here, def about, and so I'll set up a route and I'll set up a Python function which will be executed after I have run that particular route. So I just return some data. For example, this is the Spark bootcamp, and I run it. When I go to the browser and I access that particular route, which is about, and you can see this is the Spark bootcamp has been returned. So that function was run and it has returned this, and the browser will display it. So what is happening here is, see, that route was accessed there. It will send a request here on the server, and this will the Flask server will check whether such a route has been defined already or not. If it finds that, then it will run the function which is defined beneath it, and this is why these functions are working. Okay, so now for example, if I want a more personalized or customized one, so I'll give it input in the root itself. Okay, so I'll just add name, and so how I give input is like this, like for example, for a string input I have this, and yeah, so I'll add it this way. Then I'll define the function, obviously, def name, and return, for example. So here obviously I have to use an f string because I have to give an input in the return statement or the print statement only. User is username. Okay, so now when I go and access this in the browser, for example, yeah, it gives me an error. So can anyone tell me why this error is coming? Yeah, exactly. So because I have not given an input, yeah, so it's getting an unknown input because I've not given that same input in the function which I have defined, but in the route only. So I have to define it here as well, and I'll just give it the input which is username, and it has detected the change. So when I go back, it is running, this route is accessing properly. So this is how, these are the basic functions that we set up. So we have set up the basic Flask app, we have imported the class, instantiated the object, defined the functions, the basic ones, and run the app. Now can anyone tell me what are CRUD operations? Anyone? We just talked about it. Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, that's correct. So what are the CRUD operations? Are create for post, read for get, and update for put, and then we have delete for delete, right? So now we are going to the next step, which is the basic app setup is done. We have done this as well, which is setting up the CRUD routes. Okay, so now when we have to set up a post function, for example, so I'll create a route in the application, and then suppose I access it in the browser, but then I'll have to send a data with it, which is the item that I want to create. So here we are not using an actual database because you have not been taught about it as of yet, but we are using a mock database, which is a list of dictionaries, and in the list each dictionary is representing an item. So this item will further have fields, for example an ID or a name, right? So what will happen is you'll access that there with the date, and you'll send a request with the data in it, and then that data will be extracted and read, and then the server will add that data or the data of that particular item that you want to create in the database, and then it will return probably a message that the data has that item has been created. But it is not always the case that the data sent by the client is right. For example, we'll need to check some things in the data to validate that data so that we don't get a wrong item with the wrong fields, for example. So any guesses how will we validate the data? Anyone? Yeah, so we'll have to check the keys in it. For example, if we don't have an ID or we don't have the name, then we can't put that item, or that data is not validated. So this is the code. Also we'll need to check one more thing, that if the ID is already present in the that database, then we can't create, because an ID is a unique identifier of an item, and there can't be two things with the same ID. So we need to check that. And Yeah, so what I have done is I've written the decorator and I've written the route that I want to create. So you can name it yourself whatever you want. Then I've specified the method, and that request.json, what it is doing is it's extracting the data from that JSON format, and a new item, it is storing it in the variable new item. After that, it is checking that if all the keys are present, all the keys in ID and name are present in that new item, and if it's not the case, then it will return invalid data. So JSONify is another class, and request is also another class in Flask, which help you in certain functions. Like JSONify will return a JSON response, which REST APIs work with, and it will also return the status code with it, which is 400 here, because 400, as we saw earlier, was for when there is a BT from the client side, right? So that is why 400 error has been returned here. Then we'll check the ID. If the ID already exists in the database, then we'll return a JSONify. So in the JSON format, we'll return an error, which is item with this ID already exists. And if both of these errors are not present, or maybe if you want to put any other validation from your side, after that we'll just append that new item in the database. So here the database is a list, that is why we're using append. In actual way, it's not like that. Now we'll see this in Postman. I've set up the CRUD roots already, and so I've written that URL here with the root specified, right? And then I'll have to add a data here for that item that I want to create. Without it, this will not work. So I add it in. So the ID, for example, is 3, and the name is item. Yeah, 1 second. Oh, this is not working because the CRUD roots were not set up here. It was set up in some other file actually. 1 second. Yeah. So yeah, the CRUD roots are set up in this file, right? You can see I've imported request and JSONify here as well, which is important thing to do. This is the mock database that I talked about with the ID, name, and 2 items are there. That's why I added the ID as 3 there, so as to not get an error. I have set up this route here, and I run this one. So now when I go to Postman and I send the request, you can see that it has returned a JSON response, which is the item itself, which is with the ID and the name, right, with a 201 created status code. So yeah, is this fine? Yeah, so CRUD operation is create, read, update, and delete, right? So here we are creating. So HTTP method में it is mapped to post. So हमने method को post किया है, यहाँ पे specify कर दिया है. So जो भी मुझे करना होगा, I'll specify that method there. Even in Postman, this is very important कि side पे जो method होता है, I have to specify that. Next, we come to the So what we have done here is, सबसे पहले हमने import किया सब कुछ. We have set up the app, and then the database, mock database यहाँ पे है, and then the basic roots are there, right? तो आफ्टर दैट जैसे हमने वो क्रिएट किए थे, वैसे ही हमने CRUD ऑपरेशन क्रिएट किया. जैसे कि हमने डेकोरेटर यूज़ किया, रूट डाला, मेथड स्पेसिफाई किया. फॉर गेट यू डोंट हैव टू, बिकॉज हमने ओपन नहीं किया था, बट यहाँ पे जैसे हमने पोस्ट यहाँ पे अपडेट डाल दिया है. एंड देन यू क्रिएट द फंक्शन सेम वे जैसे ऊपर किया था. यू टेक दैट डेटा दैट इज़ कमिंग, वो भी JSON फॉर्मेट में आएगा बिकॉज दिस इज़ अ REST API दैट वी आर सेटिंग अप. तो उसे एक्सट्रैक्ट करके रीड करने का काम request.json कर रही है, एंड इट स्टोरिंग इट इन न्यू आइटम वेरिएबल. then we check the keys, then we check that the ID is not same, and accordingly we'll return the JSONify or JSON responses, right, and the status codes. Then you just add it in the database, and yeah, if the data is perfectly fine, then you return the JSON format variable, that new item that you created earlier with the status code 201, right, because it has been created successfully. So this is how you're going to set up all the routes. मतलब बेसिक सेम रहेगा कि रूट जो है वो उसका रूट सेटअप किया, then method, and then the function. Okay, so next we have the get route that we have to set up. So now जब तुम्हें get route setup करना है तो either you will get all the items, मतलब अगर तुम्हें read करना है तो you will get all the items from the database, or just one by an ID suppose, or by a name, whatever you want. तो उसके लिए दो different functions you can set up, right? तो जैसे यहाँ पर अगर तुम्हें get function for all है, you have to read all the items, you just set up the route, set up the method, and then you just return the database as a JSON, because here the database is a list, so that is not going to create any problems. So, and if you want to get it by an ID, then you just give the input, an integer input of an ID in the root itself, and then you check if that next function is checking if that item exists, that item ID exists in the database or not. So when you check and if you find it, then it's fine. Otherwise the next function will return a none, and if that item exists, then it returns a JSON item with the 200 status code, and otherwise it will just return an error which says that item has not been found. Okay, so अगर हम इसको जाके पोस्टमैन में देखते हैं, then you will go to that get all. I have already set up all the routes here, तो तुम भी कर सकते हो अपने पोस्टमैन में जाके. So I sent it यहाँ पर with the get request specified. Here I don't have to like give any data with the route, right? And you can see here तो ID1 ID2 has been created और ID3 भी create हो चुका है, which was not actually in the database, but मैंने बाद में वो post वाली function से create किया है. So you can see that here. So just a get method specified and the route perfectly set up. Then अगर मेरे पास get one वाला option है, then when I send it तो वो मुझे just एक item return करेगा which I asked for with the ID 2. Here also I don't have to give a body or like data, and if I do one, then it will give me this one. So this is just simple setup, and we are done with the read one. Okay, so now when I have to do an update, so the same thing will happen here. I'll access the root there with data, because I have to tell the server that this is what I want to change in my item. So what are the validations that I have to check here? Anyone? Like same thing that I did in post, but what? Yeah. So you'll have to check कि वो ID exist करती है कि नहीं पहले तो. Yeah. सो मतलब यहाँ पे हमें ये चेक करना पड़ेगा कि पहले तो कि वो आईडी एग्जिस्ट करती है कि नहीं. सो इफ़ दैट आईडी डज नॉट एग्जिस्ट देन आई कांट अपडेट इट. और दूसरी चीज़ दैट आई कांट अपडेट द आईडी बिकॉज एज आई टोल्ड अर्लियर कि दिस इज़ अ यूनिक आइडेंटिफायर ऑफ दैट आइटम. सो इफ़ आई चेंज द आईडी ओनली, so that would create an error, right? So the same way I have specified the method as put for update, right, which is the mapping in HTTP. I have given an integer ID as input, and yeah, that you have to write in this form here. then you extract the data, and if you check that if that ID is an update item that you have got as a request, so then you cannot update the ID of the item. And if ID does not exist, then the item cannot be updated. So when you check it in the Postman, for example, I want to update, and I just write the name field, I want to update the third one. Okay, I'll change the name. It was item 3 before as well. So I'll just say updated item 3, and you can see that it has been updated here. So yeah, if I go to get all, you can see here as well that it has been updated. So this shows that my put or update function is properly working. But what if I had added an ID here as well, like this, and when I send it, it says that I cannot update the ID of the new item, of that item. Yeah, so this is the how the update function is set up. And the next one is delete. So delete, in you don't have to give any data, but just the ID in the root. So I'll show you here. You just give the ID as 3, for example. When you send the request, it says that item has been deleted successfully. Now when you go to get all, you will not see item 3 because it has been deleted. Looking at the code, I'll set up the root, the method, and what global database is doing is that the changes that I'm making in the database will be like done in the database as well, that I have made, like the mock database. And then I'll write the code and add those items in database that were not equal to the item ID that I provided in the input. And then I'll return just a JSON message that item was deleted successfully. So this is the delete, and we have set up all the CRUD operations. Any doubts? Yeah. So JSON is JavaScript object notation. So what happens is, in a REST API, the data that is transmitted is in JSON. So here also I'm getting all the data in JSON, and I have to send it back in JSON as well, because this server that I've created is acted as an API, right? So that API is going to send and get responses in JSON. Okay, so that brings us to the question that why is this called a REST API? What we have set up here, why is it called a REST API? So the reason is, यहाँ पे एक तो मैंने जो HTTP के साथ मैपिंग होती है, that are the methods that I've used. अब इसके अलावा fetch या और भी थोड़े से methods होते हैं, but we have used the HTTP methods, right? Also कि जो सारा कुछ डाटा प्रोवाइड हो रहा है, जा रहा है, that is in JSON. तो दो चीज़ें हैं कि the methods are HTTP mapped, और दूसरा कि JSON में इधर से उधर डेटा जा रहा है. So this is why this is a REST API. Okay, so we are done with this, all the CRUD root setup. Now before the next session, ये एक exercise है which is for practice. तो you can do this. इससे वो जो concepts जो हमने सीखे हैं, they can be applied. So here you have to build a library management API, and we have already like understood how to set up a basic Flask app. ठीक है, तो ये basic pre-class setup होना चाहिए, and you should know how to do this. ठीक है, then we have like a mock database, तो जिसमें कुछ fields हैं, you can add your own. If you want, you can add more items as well, and you can create your own mock database. After that, there are some things that you need to do. For example, set up all these routes for get and post. You can read them later properly, right? You can search the books by title or author, and then, as we discussed, the common pitfall discussions that we did. So that is also important thing that you need to think about when you're setting up the routes. Then there are some questions, and yeah, so you can do this later. Okay, so now we are done with this, and there was one last thing that I needed to talk about. Okay, yeah, so these sessions that you have been provided with, this Spark bootcamp as a whole, so this is a very good opportunity for you. मतलब इसमें मिस मत करना, especially for the freshers. It's a very good opportunity because अगर तुम dedicatedly ये sessions लगा लेते हो, then at the end it's kind of like कि तुम एक full stack, तुम्हें काफ़ी कुछ पता लग जाएगा, ठीक है. If you are not interested in everything, तो तुम्हें वो चीज़ मिल जाएगी जो तुम्हें पसंद है, right? तो एक dedicatedly ये sessions लगा लेना. ऑल्सो आई नो कि वीडियो लेक्चर्स अपलोडेड हैं इन सब के लिए और होते रहेंगे. सो द थिंग इज़ लाइक अगर तुम इन पर्सन आके सीखोगे इट विल बी बेटर बिकॉज यू विल कनेक्ट विद पीयर्स जो सेम चीज़ सीखना चाहते हैं एंड यू कैन ग्रो टुगेदर. एंड वी ऑल नो कि मतलब यूट्यूब पे 1 घंटे की जो वीडियो होती है वो 2x में भी चलाओ तो 3 घंटे में ही ख़त्म होती है. सो इट्स बेटर इफ़ यू कम इन पर्सन एंड यू आस्क योर डाउट्स एंड यू अंडरस्टैंड. एंड देन यू इफ़ यू वांट टू रिवाइज या तुम्हें कोई डाउट है जो तुम उस टाइम नहीं समझ पाए तो तुम ये कर सकते हो. सो थैंक यू फॉर कमिंग. दिस इज़ द एंड ऑफ द सेशन. थैंक यू फॉर गिविंग अस योर टाइम. और ये कर लेना एक्सरसाइज. एंड दैट्स ऑल दैट वी नीडेड टू टॉक अबाउट फॉर टुडे. Okay then. Okay. Thank you.